Large amount of information to cover tonight in only a brief period of time. What we're going to be doing is answering one question, and that's the following. How did Rome enter the Jewish state of affairs? We're going to look at this from the Roman point of view, then from the Jewish point of view, and then we'll look at the combined results of our answer to this question. How did Rome enter the Jewish picture, or the Jewish state of affairs? We're going to be skipping back 2 weeks ago to tie in that information with tonight's teaching, as well as 1 week ago and tie in that information. 2 weeks ago, we rounded out by looking at the kingship and high priesthood of two people, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, specifically dealing with the period from 67 to 63 BC. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week, our topic was the dawn of Rome. We just gave you a little bit of the background information for correct knowledge of the founding of Rome as a world power and its progress through the Punic Wars, through the subjugation of the Greek city-states by sacking Corinth in 146 BC, through her gaining, that is Rome gaining part of the territories of Asia Minor, whenever Attalus bequeaths part of his territory in Pergamum over to the Roman Senate. And then that brings us really up to the beginning of the 1st century BC. So let's start there this evening. First of all, we're going to look at the position of Rome, or the side of Rome, in answering this question, how did Rome enter the Jewish state of affairs? By the beginning of the 1st century BC, according to the end of last week's teaching, we have seen that Rome is making large inroads, finally and for the first time, into the eastern Mediterranean lands. She's done a lot north, south, and west, but it's not until the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 1st century. In other words, that would run from 125 BC to 75 BC, the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 1st century BC, that Rome begins making large inroads, large permanent inroads, I guess I should say, into the eastern Mediterranean lands. She's had somewhat to do with some of the eastern territories, such as the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, as far back as the 3rd century BC. But that's never been permanent because the strength of the Roman Empire was not then what it is at this current time. Now, around 90 BC, so we're a decade into the very beginning of the 1st century BC, around 90 BC, we have something that's rather significant happening back westwardly from the point of view of Palestine. And that is all of the Italian peninsula, pretty much in unison, rises in revolt against Rome. Now, a lot of the northern tribes, especially the northwestern tribes in the Italian peninsula, had risen during the Second Punic War to help fight on the side of Carthage against Rome. And Rome was successful in subduing them. This time the reason is not with the Punic Wars in mind, or with Hannibal or the city of Carthage as a backdrop, but rather it's the desire, and this desire no doubt existed earlier, such as at that time, the Second Punic War, but it's the desire for Rome to grant full citizenship to the people of the various Italian tribes in the Italian peninsula. Now, this whole question of Roman citizenship is something that we will look at in quite a bit more detail later on. But if you'll just turn over to the book of Acts for a moment, just to point out a passage or so here to see where and how Roman citizenship was something that was very important. In Acts chapter 16 and chapter 22. In other words, there were certain things that Roman citizenship guaranteed for you. And to have citizenship would be to have these privileges, just like it's true with any civilized country like the United States. Citizenship brings certain blessings as well as requirements, but certain blessings as well. Now here, Paul and Silas, we know that they've been beaten, they've been thrown into prison. They see Romans 8:28 working out for them. They end up with people converted as a result of this. And finally down in verse 35, Acts chapter 16, the leaders here in Philippi, which was a Roman colony, we'll discuss that later, what actually is a colony, but we see it's a colony back from verse 12, sends to the prison and says that these men, Paul and Silas, can go. Notice verse 37. Paul's not just using some of Jesus' earlier teaching as well as some of his own teaching, saying, well, now it's such a blessing to be persecuted, then, we just want to enjoy all of our persecution and stay as long as possible. No, he's pretty wise. He says in verse 37, they've beaten us openly, uncondemned, being Romans, which was against Roman law as far as citizenship was concerned. They have beaten us openly, uncondemned, being Romans. Not them being Romans, but we being Romans, that is, Roman citizens. And have cast us into prison. And now do they thrust us out privily? Oh, nay, verily, Paul says, but let them come themselves and fetch us out. Now, that might kind of sound anti-Sermon on the Mount or something, but that's just, I often thought of this verse whenever I was listening to Dr. Freeman's teaching on Sermon on the Mount, and this verse never really seemed to mesh with their interpretation of all of that, because you're just never supposed to cause any problems, especially to your superiors, especially to governmental political leaders. And that's exactly what we have here. But Paul just kind of throws something in their teeth. He said, you've done something to us against the law, so we're going to make you pay for it. You come down here and bring us out yourself, and that will show to the people. Of course, it will help the gospel in the long run that we're not wrong, but that you're wrong. They told these words unto the magistrates, and they feared when they heard that they were Romans. And they came. They did just what Paul said to do, and besought them and brought them out and desired them to depart out of the city. They went out of the prison and entered into the house of Lydia, and when they had seen the brethren, they comforted them and departed. So Roman citizenship gave them certain privileges. Obviously at Philippi they were abused, but the privileges were intact nonetheless as far as the law was concerned. Then in the 22nd chapter, in order to get the truth out of this man Paul, that Lysias, the chief captain of the cohort stationed at the fortress of Antonia, thought, mistakenly so, was an earlier Egyptian who had caused turmoil in the city of Jerusalem. The only way to get the truth out of this man is to beat him. So verse 24, the chief captain, which was Claudius Lysias, commanded him to be brought into the fortress. It's not a castle. We think of medieval England or Scotland with castles, but a fortress, and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by. And notice that little phrase there, unto the centurion. That's a Roman word. Or a Latin word, I should say. So we would have to understand something about Rome to understand that. That stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman who's uncondemned? That is, he's not gone through the official process of trial. Not a trial by jury, but a trial by the prefect or the procurator. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. Then the chief captain came and said unto him, tell me, art thou a Roman? Paul said, yes. The chief captain answered, with a great sum obtained I this freedom. It could be purchased. Citizenship could be purchased. And Paul said, but I was freeborn. Paul had one up on that political leader as well. It cost you a lot of money, but Paul said, I was freeborn. What Paul meant by that's difficult really to know, but we'll get into that more later on when we discuss Roman citizenship. What got us off on that? Well, this is the reason for the sedition in the Italian peninsula, 90 BC, where the various tribes are demanding full citizenship, which they are granted somewhere around the end of the first decade or sometime during the second decade of the first century BC. And this set in motion the process of events that finally brings a fall to the great Roman Republic, which had existed in its golden days back since the 5th century BC. That's some of what we had talked about last time. So there are different things. There's Rome as the Republic, where it was governed by the so-called senators, the Senate of Rome, and the imperial Rome that is controlled by a dictatorship, which we will later see, probably starting next week. Beginning with Julius Caesar, the first of the dictators of imperial Rome, and will continue all the way until Romulus Augustus, the last emperor when the Roman Empire falls in the year 476 AD. So we'll get into that a little later on, but you probably should know the difference now between senatorial Rome and imperial Rome, or Rome as a republic and Rome as a dictatorship, that it has existed from its glorious days in the 5th century BC down to the beginning of the 1st century BC. Rome as a republic. And then beginning with this revolt in the early decades of the 1st century BC, Rome as the republic, with the full power invested in the Roman Senate, begins to pass off the scene. Now, it doesn't overnight, it doesn't all pass off the scene right now, but it begins to pass off the scene because we'll have to come way down into the 5th and 6th decade of the 1st century BC to get to the actual institution under the first and then the second triumvirate of the dictatorship of Rome, which begins imperial Rome as such, which even more particularly begins with not Julius Caesar but Augustus Caesar. So imperial Rome, Rome controlled by the emperors, dictator maybe is a little too modern of a word. They were referred to as emperors, or of course most of them took the name of Julius Caesar and they were known as the Caesars. Just like the leaders in Egypt were known as the pharaohs. The emperors of Rome were known as the Caesars after Julius Caesar. And that lasts until the fall of Rome in 476 AD. The last Roman emperor being Romulus Augustus. Took the name of Romulus, the founder of Rome, Augustus, the first of the great leaders of Rome in the period known as the Pax Romana, a period of several hundred years of Roman peace that extended throughout the Mediterranean world. Okay, you're up to date. Let's see about when that puts us on our chart. Now, you're not going to find any of this on the chart, but I want you to be able to keep this in your mind. If you look around 90 BC on your chart and you kind of see what's going on, then we're going to work our way down tonight to come into the message down into the middle of the 1st century BC. Or a little prior to the middle, let's say around 65 to 60, although it even goes earlier than that and it does extend later than that. But let's just say by the mid-1st century BC, Pompey, P-O-M-P-E-Y, Pompey, becomes the most important military figure in Rome. And his rise to importance coincides, but by a slight degree, comes before the rise of importance of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar probably being the better known of the two, but nonetheless Pompey is well known in his own regard. Now, Pompey had been invested with military power by the Roman Senate for, among other things, one particular mission. I've got the wrong map on. I think you know where it is anyway. He was given orders by the Roman Senate to stop the harassment of Roman shipping in the eastern Mediterranean world. Remember, Rome, through the Punic Wars, has become a great naval power. She knows how to fight on land, there's no doubt about that, but because the Mediterranean Sea is your backyard lake, then in order to get different places, you have to know something about being a maritime power, which of course Rome has thoroughly demonstrated in the 3 successive defeats of Carthage in the Punic Wars. So, getting back to what I was saying, the harassment of Roman shipping in the eastern Mediterranean Empire was caused by the pirate king of Pontus, known as Mithridates VI. That seems again to be a dynastic title. like Abimelech was for the kings in Gerar in the Old Testament. And you compare the accounts in Samuel and the superscription to Psalm 34, as well as the Caesars in Rome, as well as the Pharaohs in Egypt. Mithridates, M-I-T-H, just like it sounds, really, R-A-D-A-T-E-S. Mithridates the Sixth, who was a pirate king of Pontus. I remember studying, I can remember vividly my test questions about Mithridates in college. Since I've got a different map prepared to go up ahead, let's turn in to your Bible maps. See if you can find Pontus way up on the Black Sea. You see what type of individual we're talking about here. Because you'd have to come all the way down through the Hellespont into the Aegean Sea, and then south of Rhodes, really, to get out into the eastern Mediterranean Sea world. And Mithridates VI, the pirate king of Pontus, was doing just this. That was a chief problem Rome was having around this time, the middle of the 1st century B.C. Now, have you found Asia Minor and the northernmost province? You should see up top of Galatia, you should see Pontus, just lying on the southern shore of the Black Sea. You find that in your Bible map, Pontus? Okay, there's where Mithridates' kingdom is. And so as you work your way toward the southwest, you have to go by Byzantium there, then through the Hellespont or the Bosporus Straits, past Troas, into the Aegean Sea, and down north of Crete or south of Rhodes or south of Cyprus or wherever he was at different times to practice the harassment of Roman shipping. That was what made Pompey so famous, because other people had been sent out after Mithridates and no one had been successful in stopping his pirating activities against Roman vessels and Roman shipping. And this is what gave Pompey the final seal of approval in his military career. He was able to finally defeat Mithridates VI. Okay, what are we asking ourselves? How did Rome enter the Jewish state of affairs? So notice how this is bringing the most important military figure in Rome to the east, closer and closer to Palestine, to the east, to defeat Mithridates VI, the pirate king of Pontus. So from the Roman point of view, we see that she is approaching Jewish territory, first of all, because of the situation of Attalus bequeathing Pergamum to the Roman Senate, and secondly, and more importantly, because of the important military figure of Pompey coming after Mithridates VI. Okay, let's go then to the Jewish point of view in answering this question. How did Rome enter the Jewish state of affairs? In other words, simultaneously, events are working at both ends of the spectrum, both in Rome and in Palestine, to seem almost like a magnet for Palestine and the Jewish situation there to draw Rome into the conflicts through which Israel herself is going. That covered initially what I wanted to say, tying it into last week's message. Now in your mind, let's go back to 2 weeks ago, the message 2 weeks ago, and tie that into what I want to say now. And I will review that briefly for you. The situation here on the death of Alexandra, you will need your chart for this, in 67 BC, is that we have a state of turmoil that erupts between Hyrcanus II, who had been high priest here under the Queen Alexandra, and his brother Aristobulus II. Now Aristobulus II was the more adventurous of the two. Hyrcanus was pretty laid back, pretty easygoing, was satisfied with the high priesthood, if that at all. It had its own duties that were attached to it, and he did not seem to be the type of person, like so many people have been that we've studied, like his brother Aristobulus II, who really enjoyed getting his hands into what's going on. So in 67, BC, Aristobulus, along with the Sadducees. Remember, the Pharisees had been in power and prestige for a while, then it was the Sadducees. Then it was the Pharisees under Alexander. Alexander Jannaeus had said, let's put the Pharisees back in power according to legend on his deathbed. And Alexandra does put them back in power, and you have that on your chart. Underneath Alexander and Hyrcanus II, the Pharisees are in power. Well, whenever Aristobulus wants to make a move against his brother Hyrcanus, and of course he has to recruit the help of the Sadducees. So he recruits the help of the Sadducees, and he defeats Hyrcanus II near Jericho in 67 BC. Now, it wasn't really a major defeat for Hyrcanus II, because he didn't really like the duties that he had to perform anyway. And so an agreement was made that everything would be turned over to the control of Aristobulus II, with the condition that Hyrcanus II would be allowed to live alone, unmolested, as a private citizen in Jerusalem, which I said 2 weeks ago is what he probably wanted all along. He enjoyed no duties at all, just leave him alone and let him live. Now, so we don't have a problem with Hyrcanus. That would just leave Aristobulus in control. But our chart gives us a dotted line underneath his name, Aristobulus II. So we know something, some type of sway of power is going on. That is caused by this man over 43 BC on your chart, Antipater. Antipater was an Idumean. We've talked about the Idumeans, how they've been subjugated and forced into the Jewish way of life, how they have moved up, they've been pushed out by the invading Nabateans south of the Dead Sea, and they're up as far as Hebron, which is just a little south of the capital city of Jerusalem. Antipater, the Idumean, is able to persuade Hyrcanus that Hyrcanus is not in such a good position after all. Hyrcanus thinks, I'm in a good position. My brother Aristobulus has defeated me, but I don't care. I'd rather be defeated because I don't want to be high priest. I don't want to be king. I don't want all the responsibilities of controlling either politically or religiously all of these Jewish people. I would rather have my own private residence and be allowed to live alone unmolested there. So everything's going fine. However, Antipater says, well, your state is not so good after all, because doesn't it always happen, according to the proven of history, the proofs of history before, that no one is really going to allow his relatives to survive whenever he comes to the throne? There's always the problem that your father's going to try to take over, that your brother's going to take over, your nephew's going to take over, your mother's going to take over. Some type of court coup is going to happen if you don't get rid of all surviving relatives. And so the thought of fear is implanted in the mind of Hyrcanus II that your brother, Aristobulus II, is going to have you killed. He cannot just allow you to live. Things are going fine for you now, but 2 years from now, what if the thought comes into your mind, I would like to be leader? Then Aristobulus has trouble on his hands. So he put this thought in the mind. It's a humorous story, but he puts this thought in the mind of Hyrcanus, which is probably not a true thought at all. I'm sure Aristobulus would have just left him alone because he knew his brother. His brother was a very passive individual. But he puts this thought there, and so we've got problems now as far as Hyrcanus is concerned. So Antipater with his Idumean force and Hyrcanus with his Pharisaic force. The Pharisees are out because Aristobulus has favored the Sadducees, along with, in the third place, Aretas and his Arabs. They all come against Aristobulus II around 65 BC. Hyrcanus II with the Pharisees, Antipater with the Idumeans, the Edomites from the Old Testament name, and Aretas, Aretas, who's an Arabian. They all come against Aristobulus, who shuts himself up in the temple in 65 BC. That's about where we were 2 weeks ago. I just trying to review that to bring you up to date again in your mind in case you don't remember all of that. Now what happens here? Both brothers appealed to Rome, which was exactly precisely the type of opening for which Rome had been hoping and for which she had been looking, no doubt, all along. Rome wasn't the type of power that would just, she wasn't a barbarous people at this time, middle of the 1st century BC, like, for instance, the Assyrians had been in the Old Testament period. She would not just come in and conquer and take over a territory because of the cultural situation in which she had been for several centuries now. She liked to at least begin working through diplomatic channels. And here was a perfect diplomatic excuse to gain entrance into the affairs of Palestine. Both brothers appeal. Aristobulus appeals to Rome, come and help me against my brother Hyrcanus and against these people that he has on his side. And Hyrcanus would say, come, Rome, and help me against my brother Aristobulus and these people that he has on his side. And so it puts Rome in a very enviable position where you almost can win either way you go. You can accept the offer of Aristobulus or accept the offer of Hyrcanus and say, well, certainly, we'll be glad to come to Israel, to Palestine, and help you out. And in the back of their mind, the concluding part of the phrase would be, and we will stay there permanently once we arrive. So it was a perfect opening for Rome. Now, prior to this time, if you remember some of the earlier studies that we've done, Rome always surrendered territories back over to the local people, particularly those in the eastern part of the Mediterranean world. This had happened way back as early as the time of Antiochus the Great. Why did she do that earlier and not now? Well, she's had a change in her foreign policy, that's to be certain, and that is simply because at the earlier times at which we have previously looked, she simply was not strong enough to be able to garrison, that is, put troops in these places, to be able to garrison such a far-flung empire with such vast territorial claims. Rome of the mid-1st century BC has changed her foreign policy because she's a different Rome. Because she has gone through victory after victory, the Punic Wars, the defeat of Carthage, the burning and sacking of Corinth, the bequeathment of Attalus, of Pergamum to the Roman Senate in 133, the defeat by Pompey of Mithridates VI, the pirate king of Pontus, victory after victory has done nothing but encourage Rome and encourage Rome's military and territorial adventures, or at least her thoughts in these directions. She's much stronger of a people and of a nation than she's ever been before. Consequently, if, and she does here, she gets her foot in the door of a territory in the eastern Mediterranean world, she's probably going to leave it there. She's going to stay whenever she comes. And this is precisely what happens. So, summing everything up, notice that we've got reasons based on the constitution of Rome and what's going on in Roman circles now with the defeat of Mithridates and already conquered Gaul and North Africa. So the only place you have to go is toward the east, with Rome already heading in that direction. And now Israel, it just so happens, it all works out at the perfect time. It just so happens that that Israel is in such a bind with these two brothers that they both think they need to appeal to Rome for help. It's kind of like putting the square peg in the square hole. Everything fits together perfectly now. So let's begin looking at some results. What actually takes place here in bringing Rome into Palestine and bringing Rome permanently into Palestine. She'll control Palestine for 130 or so years, for as long as Palestine, or Israel I should say, as a nation exists. Of course, she continues to control that territory as such afterwards, but the Jews have been defeated, their city has been sacked, and the temple has been destroyed, and so the people as such don't have anything to look forward to. Okay, let's start looking up ahead of us. Pompey, he's defeated Mithridates, the beginning, or the middle rather, of the 1st century BC. That gets him over in this direction of Asia Minor anyway. Pontus is maybe somewhere way up here at the top of the room. So he's got land forces, obviously, now, because he's up here. He's coming down through Asia Minor. He's coming into this whole Seleucid Empire, which goes all the way up to here. Tarsus is about right here, and it circles back around. So we have Damascus, an important city we'll talk about here in a moment, and Antioch up here a little bit further. He comes down into Antioch, which is the capital of Syria, or of the Seleucid Empire, and defeats the Seleucid garrison that's stationed here at Antioch in the year 64 BC. Note this on your chart. This is the final end to this celebrated Seleucid kingdom and empire, which came on the scene, remember, after the death of Alexander the Great. We have been studying the Seleucids for a long period of time in our studies in the intertestamental period. This whole chart that you're looking at before you there deals with the Seleucid Empire, among other empires, most notably the Ptolemaic. So notice here, you should see on your chart the date 64. Antiochus the 13th, Asiaticus, the last leader, the last king we have of the Seleucid Empire, and you ought to have your 64 date there marked so it stands out to you. 64, the Seleucid Empire comes to an end. Notice what's written out to the right of that. Syria is made a Roman province. Syria is made a Roman province. So here's the first thing that's going on after already having looked at Rome and the Jewish state of affairs, to bring Pompey, who, remember, at this time is the most celebrated military figure in Rome, or in the Roman Empire, to bring him down through Syria, and of course it will bring him eventually into Palestine. So 64 is an important date to remember, inasmuch as the Seleucid kingdom passes off the scene and Syria passes into the hands of the Roman Empire.
For the continuation of this message, please turn
as the whenever Pompey, P-O-M-P-E-Y, whenever Pompey arrives in Syria, then he sends his general, Scaurus, S-C-A-U-R-U-S. He sends his general, Scaurus, the name is spelled on your chart, to evaluate the Jewish state of affairs. In other words, news from the two brothers, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, reaches Pompey whenever he arrives in Antioch in Syria. That is, the news of both of them requesting his help, each requesting his help against his brother. And so, in response to this, he sends his general, Scaurus, to evaluate the state of affairs. Scaurus comes down to Palestine. He listens to the arguments and the proposals of the two brothers, and he favors Aristobulus. Aristobulus is the current king, but he's currently, remember, locked up in the temple. Temple is a very fortified area, the whole temple precinct there, so he's had himself locked up in there for a year, from 65 now down to 64 BC. Why does Scaurus favor Aristobulus? Because he offers a larger bribe. A bribe in those days was just as natural as sunshine. It always had to go along with some political endeavor. Scaurus warns Aretas, the Arabian leader. Remember, we've mentioned that there's another Aretas over in the end of 2 Corinthians 11. That was another either dynastic name or at least a dynastic setup of great-grandfather, grandfather, father, son, because we know we have four of them. We'll end up with Aretas the fourth in the New Testament. This is Aretas the third. Is told to withdraw from Jerusalem with his Nabatean Arabs. Remember, Aretas has come to the help of, or to offer help to Hyrcanus II, and he brings his Nabateans along with him. Now Pompey, after the subjugation of Syria through the defeat of Antioch, then moves on down to the second important city of Syria, which moves him that much closer to Palestine, and that is the city of Damascus up here. He moves on down to Damascus and takes up his command post here. There's Damascus. Here's Jerusalem. Whenever he arrives in Damascus, then he hears the report of Scaurus. Scaurus, his general, has said that he favors Aristobulus over Hyrcanus II because he offers a larger bribe. Whenever Pompey arrives here, after hearing the report of Scaurus, he summons both of the brothers to Damascus to come before him and present their cases personally. They come. It's true that Aristobulus offers the larger bribe, but Pompey, you don't get to be a great man generally by accident, although some people might beg to differ there. Generally you don't. Pompey is Pompey and not Scaurus, and Scaurus is Scaurus and not Pompey because of Pompey's discernment. Pompey talks to both of the brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. He understands full well that Aristobulus offers the larger of the two bribes. That's important, but that's not as important as what Pompey is able to discern in talking with the two brothers. What's he able to discern? We've talked about the character of the two brothers. One of the brothers is just passive by nature. That's Hyrcanus. That kind of would suit Rome. We want someone to be our puppet leader down here who doesn't really care about being a leader anyway. Aristobulus, he offers a larger bribe, but he's got a rebellious strain in him. And if we put Aristobulus, if we give him our favor, and the Pharisees and Aretas and his Nabateans and Hyrcanus II are defeated and expelled, pushed out, and we leave, if they leave, of course we're assuming, then what would happen down there in Judea and Palestine but that Aristobulus would have these notions in his mind of independence from the Roman Empire. So he's able to discern the character of the two brothers. One is more active, one is more passive. He favors the passive of the two brothers, that is Hyrcanus II. He thinks that he detects plans in discussing things with Aristobulus that he might have against Rome. So, Aristobulus is not very happy about this. Whenever he and his brother leave Damascus, then he holds up in Alexandria. It's not Alexandrium as such at this time. It will become that later, and we will discuss this later on. But here's Alexandria. But anyway, there was an essential city there, just not as fortified as under Herod the Great. He comes and holds up in Alexandrium with some of his forces, as though we can laugh about the matter, as though he was going to do something to Rome or do something to Pompey. They just conquered the whole world, of course, so I don't think Aristobulus would stand much of a chance. So he holds up there in Alexandrium, and Pompey comes from Damascus whenever he hears what Aristobulus has done, because he can tell that there are overtones here of revolt behind the actions. They're very obviously behind the actions of Aristobulus. Whenever he arrives in Alexandrium, Aristobulus says, okay, I surrender. No battle, no fight. So he gives up Alexandrium to Pompey, flees down to Jerusalem, and stations his men there, and prepares for a fight again. Whenever Pompey finally arrives at Jerusalem, a day or so later, we're all the way down here to the bottom now, then Aristobulus said, no fighting. Every time it was a lot of boasting, until Pompey got there. He holds up there, no fighting, he wants to surrender. However, we do have something important taking place here. He's got a whole lot of diehards behind him. He's got a whole lot of Sadducees who are diehards behind him, and these guys place themselves in the temple fortifications This does not include Aristobulus. Aristobulus has pretty much given up and surrendered. But these Sadducees and other political Jewish zealots that were on the side of Aristobulus hole up in the fortifications of the temple, and then this actually brings Pompey against the city then in battle. So in 63 B.C., a year now has gone by, and it would take about a year for all of these events to take place. Pompey attacks the city, not so much attacks the city because all the gates of the city weren't closed against him or something, it was just the precincts of the temple. He attacks the temple. The people holed up in the temple are able to last for 3 months, from late spring to midsummer. Josephus is probably incorrect whenever he said that the final cataclysmic event took place on Day of Atonement. That would put it all the way up into the fall. That's probably a mistake on behalf of Josephus, but I just share that with you, that in his writings, in his discussion of what we're discussing now, he dates the fall of the temple to Pompey in 63 B.C. on the Day of Atonement, which is up in the month of October. The better records of history let us know that Pompey did actually break through the fortifications of the temple after a 3-month siege in midsummer 63 B.C., and 12,000 Jews were slaughtered. This is all because of the wishy-washy dealings of Aristobulus II. Whenever he actually comes to the temple building itself, he's had to work his way in fighting all through the precincts, the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, the court of the men of Israel, the court of the priests, and so forth, actually to the temple. Then the priests there are just adamant that he not enter the building, not enter the building of the temple. And of course, Pompey's not exactly a religious person, not in the biblical sense of the word, the Jewish sense of the word. So the only thing he can think is, you're hiding something in there from me that you don't want me to take. And the odds are, noticing the splendor of this building right here, the odds are they're not crumbs in there. There's probably gold and silver and treasure stored in this building. So I think I'll go in and help myself. So he pushes the priest aside. All of this evidently is historically true. He pushes the priest inside, he goes into the holy place, and he goes into the Holy of Holies. And it was simply because of the adamant priest not wanting him to go in. If they would have invited him in, he probably would have turned them down. I've got other things to do. But you can tell when someone don't want you to do something, that's sometimes the very thing you decide that you want to do. He goes in, he sees that there is gold in there, but not what he thought there would be, this huge building just piled to the ceiling with gold. So he leaves all of the temple treasures alone. That was good as far as the Jews were concerned, but it didn't outweigh the problems of a pagan military figure entering the Holy of Holies. But there's not much they could do about it. If Pompey's conquered the whole world, and they've conquered Syria, now they've conquered Palestine, and now they've taken Jerusalem, and now they've taken the temple precincts, and now they've taken the temple itself, well, there's really not a whole lot that you could do. So we date then the midsummer of 63 B.C. as the end for this short-lived 100-year period of Jewish independence. And by the way, that is the correct pronunciation, even though it might sound wrong. Short-lived, it's short-lived. There's lives, short-lived and long-lived, not short-lived and long-lived. I think I used that recently, and it sounded strange, and no one corrected me on it, so I thought I'd use it again. And let you know I don't need to be corrected on it. The short-lived period of Jewish independence. How short? 100 years. They've existed as a political entity in an independent state for a relatively short period of time, and that is approximately 100 years. Note this on your chart. 63 B.C., you've got in all caps, black letters, Roman period to the right of that. Remember that in 165 B.C., Judas Maccabeus had retaken the temple. And we have the feast that was instituted on that day and on that behalf and in commemoration of that. You remember that date, 165. Antiochus had desecrated the temple and had been desecrated for 3 years, from 168 to 165. 165, of course, is another one of those crucial dates in Israel's history between the Testaments, because she gets her temple back and worship and everything is restored. So that's 165 down to 63, almost exactly a period of 100 years of independence. Roman period on your chart begins at that time. The Jews will be controlled by Rome for the next 130 years, approximately. Or, to say it another way, until the end of their existence as a nation. The Jews, not the Romans. The Romans survive until 476 AD. Nobody lasts forever, though. Every empire that comes up goes down as well. I guess when you're living in the midst of it and you see that the Roman Empire lasted almost 1,000 years, and then the so-called Holy Roman Empire that's instituted on Christmas Day in 800 AD under Charlemagne lasts for about 100 years until the Habsburg claim in Germany is finally broken by the French dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. So you've got another thing going on there, another 1,000-year reign, but everything sooner or later has to come to an end. This then puts in leadership in Palestine Hyrcanus II. This is what you'll have on your chart. Hyrcanus II. Aristobulus is done away with because of his desires for revolt against Rome. At least that's what Pompey thinks he can discern in his personality. So the weaker, the more passive, and therefore in the Roman sense of the term, the better of the two brothers is elevated, and this is a return in elevation back to leadership, back to being high priest, but not king. No longer do we have a king. Remember, the king title starts back with Aristobulus I. He's made high priest and he's made ethnarch of the Jews. Ethnarch probably here just means a ruler of a certain people, and it's probably used in a loose sense here. Ethnic means a certain ethnic group of people. So an ethnarch is a ruler of a certain ethnic entity. Here it being Jewish. Israel at this time is reduced to a purely Jewish state, i.e. all of her conquered territories are stripped and given independence by Rome. Remember, over the last 100 years, she has extended herself under different of these Hasmonean leaders, and this Hasmonean dynasty prior to this time has extended herself particularly to the northeast and taking other territories, over to Transjordan and taking other territories there. So whenever in the midsummer of 63 BC Pompey reduces Israel to Israel, that means that Israel is stripped then. She's made a purely Jewish state, and she's stripped of all of the other territories that she has conquered. Now, Aristobulus II, what happened to him then? We said that he's deposed. He and his family, this is just a little historical note, but it's going to be a very interesting one. Aristobulus II and his family and many hundreds of Jews, among others, that is, other ethnic groups, are taken then back to Rome after 63 BC to march in Pompey's triumphal entry ceremony, which was customary and which was standard for a returning Roman general, to bring with him a sampling of the peoples, of the population, of the territories that he has conquered, to bring back to Rome with him a sampling of those peoples to march in a triumphal entry ceremony. Now, I say that to say this. If you'll look over in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 4, remember when we recently dealt with this? That was probably in one of the faith message teachings. 2 Corinthians 2:4. Now, I've never seen these two things that I'm telling you right now in connection, but it would be a good place to make a connection, understanding what we do now about 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14. 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 14. And what we're talking about now with Aristobulus and his family and other people taken back to Rome by Pompey to kind of serve as proof of the pudding that he has conquered what he said that he has conquered. Now, thanks be unto God, which always causes us to have the victory in Christ, which always causes us to be like Aristobulus II here, where we are led by the conqueror, which in this case and in our life would be the Lord Jesus Christ, who leads us in his glorious triumphal entry to show that he has been successful in subduing whatever or whomever unto himself. That's the meaning of 2 Corinthians 2:14, because there is a Roman thought, a Roman figure, part of Roman culture behind what Paul is stating there, what Paul is writing. And we being Americans, that's not familiar to us, but the people of the first century in Corinth would have understood precisely what Paul was talking about. So it's not a verse telling us we have victory in Christ, but just the reverse, that Christ has victory in us, that he rather has victory over us, and that we are led in a metaphorical sense, in a spiritual sense, we are led as his captives. So anyway, getting back to what I wanted to say about this historical note, Aristobulus II and all of these are led into Rome by Pompey to be part of his triumphal entry march, and it's been suggested, and probably rightly so, for, among other reasons, the simple reason that we don't have a better explanation for this, it's been suspected that this may help to explain the large Jewish population that we have in Rome by the 1st century A.D. How did all those Jews get there in Rome? What was the impetus? What was the catalyst that brought them from Palestine to Rome? This very event that I'm talking about may have transported enough people to Rome that after 100 years they'd been able to repopulate and procreate so that they've got a large Jewish contingency there in Rome. And of course others, maybe relatives connected to them in Palestine, could perhaps have sailed to Rome in the future. For instance, let's look at a few New Testament passages. For instance, in the book of Acts, chapter 1, or chapter 2, and verse 10. Acts chapter 2 and verse 10. Because one thing we can see from the book of Acts as well as the book of Romans, that's an important book, the book of Romans, written to Christians at Rome, some of those being Jewish in heritage and not Gentile, although no doubt the majority of the Roman church were Gentile, as the flavor of the epistle seems to indicate. These two books, though, raise an interesting question, that question being, how did and when did these Jews end up in Rome? Day of Pentecost, many Jews are coming back for one of these great annual festivals, or they're called feasts in the King James in the Old Testament. Some from Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, so forth, strangers of Rome. Now he's not talking about Gentiles here, he's talking about Jews that are making it back for the Feast of Weeks. That's called in the Greek Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks here. Strangers of Rome. We're talking about the 3rd decade A.D., the end of the 3rd decade, the beginning of the 4th decade A.D. So we're not quite 100, about 80 years beyond the date we're talking about now, with 63, 62 B.C. We've got Jews coming from Rome all the way back to Jerusalem. How did they get there in Rome to begin with? Maybe, it's just a suggestion, but people have suspected maybe this is part, at least part, if not all, of the explanation. In chapter 18, now we're moving several decades later, a score of years later, chapter 18 of the book of Acts in verse 2. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus. He's a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus. Now we know about Pontus with Mithridates. We know where he was born. Lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, parenthetical historical statement, because that Claudius, one of the Caesars, we'll discuss him later, had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. Now we'll get into this later. We know the exact date that took place. That helps us date this chapter right here, or date this experience of this man that had to have taken place just prior to what's going on right here at this time. That he commanded all Jews to depart Rome. Must have been a lot of Jews there then. How did they get there? This is part of the explanation. The last chapter, 28, verses 17 through 28. Here in the last chapter, Paul has finally arrived in Rome. Remember this, the end of the book of Acts revolves around Paul and his trials, and particularly Paul's appeal to Caesar. He said, I appeal to Caesar. And the king in Palestine said, well, if you've appealed to Caesar, then to Caesar you shall go. And he's headed in that direction. In the 27th chapter, getting past the shipwreck into the 28th chapter, it came to pass that after 3 days, let's see, verse 16, when we came to Rome. Okay, that gets us in Rome then, verse 16. He's in Rome. And it came to pass that after 3 days, Paul called the chief of the Jews together. You see, a lot of people wouldn't think about a verse like this, but it ought to be interesting to diligent Bible students. How did all those Jews get there in Rome then? He called the chief of the Jews together. When they were come together, he said, men and brethren, though I've committed nothing against the people or customs of our fathers, yet was I delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, would have let me go because there was no cause of death in me. But when the Jews spake against it, I was constrained to appeal unto Caesar. Not that I had aught to accuse my nation of, for this calls on and on and on. Of course, the Jews aren't really willing to receive what he has to say. Then he goes on in verse 25 to begin quoting part of Isaiah's prophecy, and he said, Isaiah spoke well of you Jews. You're blinded to the truth here. So verse 28, be it known therefore unto you that the salvation of God is sent unto the Gentiles, and that they will hear it. So we know we've got a large Jewish population here in Rome, and this is a suggestion as to how and when this came about. And then in Romans chapters 9 through 11, remember here in Romans 9 through 11, Paul's dealing with the question of Jewish salvation and Gentile salvation. Of course, he could just be dealing with it from an abstract theological point of view, and that would mean there wouldn't have to necessarily be any Jews there that made up the Roman population in Rome, or that made up the Roman church. But we've got Romans chapter 14. You remember what Romans 14 is all about? What's Romans 14 about? Romans chapter 14. It's written to the church at Rome. And what's the 14th chapter about? What? Someone speak it up loudly. Your foods. Foods, right. Gentiles never had any problem with foods. Who has a problem with certain things you can eat and can't eat, and days you do celebrate and don't celebrate? Jews. And Paul's writing a lot about this business about foods in Romans 14. That must mean that there has to be at least some Jews that made up the church at Rome. If you read the whole epistle, it seems like it's more Gentile than Jewish, but there'd have to be Jews there, or why this problem that Paul deals with in the 14th chapter. Okay, so in conclusion tonight, we just got a few more moments. Let me say all of this quickly then. You can go back to your chart and notice that Syria is made a Roman province. Leaders successively are appointed by Rome over Syria. In a general sense, we'll refer to them as governors. In a technical sense, they're known as legates. Legates. Scarus, who was the general of Pompey, becomes the first of these. We're not going to do a detailed study of these men. We're not going to do any study of these men, except to mention right now that probably the two most important ones in this line of legates or governors in Syria would be Crassus In 54 BC, notice his name there, Crassus. That's simply because he's part of the first triumvirate. And the last of those, Mark Antony. Important because he makes up part of the second triumvirate. That's all on your chart, if you just notice on your chart. Crassus and Antony are the most important. So we'll not do a study of these men or exactly what's going on in Syria, except as that has interplay with what's going on in Judea. We'll be back to talking many times about the legates or the imperial governors in Syria. Judea is not so much made a, should I say this? I guess this is true, yes. Judea is not so much made a Roman province, but it's just part of the Roman province of Syria. Judea is always just kind of attached to Syria. So Palestine is not dealt with in such a direct fashion, therefore it doesn't have an imperial governor or legate over it, but it has prefects over it. We will talk about that later.